Hello.
It was a chilly Saturday morning when the idea struck. My son, Alex, and I were lounging in the kitchen, enjoying our coffee when he suggested it. How about we go to the sauna as a family? It's been ages since we all did something together. I glanced up surprised. It had been years since we'd been to the sauna as a family. Memories of warm, steam-filled rooms and laughter from when Alex was younger washed over me. He was 22 now, home from university for the weekend, and I had to admit, the thought of spending time together like that again was enticing. "That sounds wonderful," I replied, a smile tugging at my lips. "We could use a bit of relaxation." He grinned, his face lighting up the way it used to when he was a boy, and I felt a pang of nostalgia. It was rare to get him all to myself these days. Between his studies and my own busy schedule, these moments of connection had become infrequent. We quickly made plans, and by the afternoon, we were driving to a cozy, family-owned sauna outside town. It was a place we used to visit often when he was a child, and it hadn't changed much. The scent of cedarwood greeted us as we entered, the warmth enveloping us like a comforting embrace. Alex held the door for me as we stepped inside, and I couldn't help but notice how much he had grown, how his shoulders had broadened and his face had taken on a maturity I hadn't fully seen before. He wasn't my little boy anymore. We rented a private room just for the two of us. It felt like a small indulgence, a quiet escape from the world. I wrapped myself in a towel and settled onto the wooden bench as Alex poured water over the hot stones. The steam billowed up, thick and soothing, filling the room with a pleasant heat. We sat in silence for a while, the air heavy with moisture. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth seep into my muscles, easing away the tension of the week. It felt good to just be present, to share this quiet space together. "You know," Alex said after a long pause, his voice softer, almost hesitant, "I missed this. I missed spending time with you." His words took me by surprise. I turned to look at him, and there was something different in his gaze, something deeper than the usual affection of a son for his mother. It caught me off guard, but I pushed the thought aside. "I missed it too," I admitted. "It's nice to just be here with no distractions." He nodded, pouring more water over the stones. The steam rose again, curling around us, making the air feel even thicker. We both leaned back, letting the heat wash over us, and I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't experienced in a long time. But then, as the minutes ticked by, I became aware of the way he was looking at me, how his eyes seemed to linger longer than they should. I tried to brush it off, but the atmosphere felt different now, charged with something I couldn't quite name. "Mom," he said quietly, almost as if testing the word. "You look relaxed." I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, that's the point of a sauna, isn't it?" He didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned closer, his expression serious, almost vulnerable. "No, I mean it. You look beautiful." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. His compliment, innocent enough, felt different. It wasn't the casual praise of a son to his mother. Carried a weight, a meaning that made my heart race. "Alex," I began, my voice uncertain. "What's going on?" He hesitated, as if struggling with what to say. "I don't know," he admitted. I feel different when I'm around you lately." The room seemed to shrink, the steam wrapping around us like a cloak. I felt a lump form in my throat as I met his gaze, searching his eyes for some sign that I was misreading the situation. But the way he was looking at me, the raw emotion there, told me I wasn't. "Alex, we can't," I whispered, shaking my head. "You're my son. This isn't right." He looked away, his face a mixture of confusion and pain. "I know," he said quietly, "but I can't help how I feel. And I don't think you can either." Tears welled up in my eyes as I grappled with the truth in his words. There had been a shift between us, something unspoken that had been growing, and I had tried to ignore it, to push it away. But now, here in this small, steamy room, there was nowhere to hide from it. "I love you, Alex," I said, my voice trembling. "But not like this. We can't cross this line." He nodded slowly, looking down at his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I needed to say it. For a long moment we sat in silence, the steam swirling around us. It felt like an eternity before I finally stood up, wrapping my towel tighter around myself. I think we should go, I said softly. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a sadness that broke my heart. Yeah, he agreed. You're probably right. We left the sauna in silence, the warmth of the room replaced by the cold reality of what had just happened. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I knew that things had changed between us, and I wasn't sure if we could ever go back to the way we were before. When we pulled into the driveway, I turned to him, placing a gentle hand on his cheek. We'll figure this out, I promised, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. He gave me a small, sad smile. I hope so, Mom. I watched him walk into the house, my heart aching with a mix of love and sorrow. We had crossed into a territory I never imagined we would, and I had no idea how we would find our way back. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The evening after the sauna, the silence in the house was palpable. I had hoped that by the time we got home, the awkwardness would dissipate, that maybe we could laugh off the strange moment in the sauna as a fleeting miscommunication. But it lingered like a dense fog hanging over us, making every glance and every word feel heavy. Alex disappeared into his room almost immediately, muttering something about needing to rest. I stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at his closed door, my heart twisting with emotions I couldn't even begin to unravel. I wanted to knock, to talk to him, to say something that would make everything okay again. But I knew better. We both needed space, time to process what had happened. I retreated to the kitchen instead, busying myself with mundane tasks, washing dishes that were already clean, wiping down the counters. Anything to keep my mind occupied. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to focus, my thoughts kept drifting back to the way he had looked at me, the raw emotion in his eyes. Was it my fault? Had I been blind to something growing between us? A part of me knew that we hadn't just stumbled into this moment in the sauna. It had been building quietly, unnoticed, like a slow tide creeping in until it was too late to step away. I poured myself a glass of wine, taking a long sip and letting the warmth settle in my chest. I was his mother. I loved him more than anything in this world, but this love was supposed to be pure, uncomplicated. The very thought of it being anything else made me feel as if I were betraying a sacred bond. My phone buzzed on the counter, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from Alex. Alex, can we talk? I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. He was just upstairs, but I understood why he had texted. We both needed a buffer, a layer of distance between us to start this conversation. Yes. Come down to the kitchen. A few moments later, I heard the creak of the stairs. He walked in slowly, his face etched with worry. He looked so much like the little boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and tear-filled eyes, searching for comfort. But now I was the one who felt lost. He sat down at the table and I joined him, my wine glass still clutched in my hand. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched on, filled with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Finally he broke it. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean to make things weird. I don't know what's happening with me." I reached across the table, placing my hand over his. "Alex, I need you to understand something," I began, choosing my words carefully. "What you said today, it's not okay. I know you're confused, and maybe we've been too close lately, but this isn't how things should be between us." His eyes dropped to our hands, and I felt his fingers squeeze mine gently. "I know," he whispered. "I've been trying to tell myself that. But the more time I spend with you, the harder it is to ignore these feelings. I don't want to feel this way, but I can't seem to stop." I pulled my hand back, needing the physical distance to think clearly. "You have to stop, Alex. We have to stop. This isn't right. You're my son, and I'm your mother. That line, it can't be crossed." He nodded, but his eyes were filled with a deep sadness. "I get it," he said, his voice barely audible. I don't know how to change how I feel. I stood up abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. I paced the kitchen, running my hands through my hair. "This is just a phase," I said, more to myself than to him. "You've been away at college, and maybe you're feeling disconnected from everything. It's normal to be close to family when you come home, but this isn't love, Alex. Not the kind you're thinking." He watched me, his expression pained. "How can you be so sure?" he asked quietly. I froze, turning to look at him. His vulnerability shook me. He wasn't challenging me. He was genuinely searching for answers, as lost in this as I was. I felt a pang of guilt, a deep, twisting sensation that maybe I had failed him somewhere along the way. Maybe our relationship had become something it shouldn't have, and I hadn't noticed until it was too late. "I know because I'm your mother," I said softly, tears stinging my eyes. "I've loved you since the moment you were born, and that kind of love, it doesn't change into something else. It just can't." He stood up slowly, taking a step toward me. "But what if it has?" His voice cracked, and I could see the tears welling up in his eyes. "What if I can't go back to pretending it hasn't?" The raw emotion in his voice shattered something inside me. I felt my own tears spill over, and before I could stop myself, I was crying. He stepped closer, hesitating for a moment before wrapping his arms around me. I buried my face in his chest, letting the sobs come, letting the pain of this impossible situation wash over me. "I don't know what to do," I whispered against his shirt. He held me tighter, his own body shaking with silent tears. "Me neither," he said. "But I don't want to lose you, Mom. Not like this." I pulled back, wiping at my tears. "You won't lose me," I promised, though my voice was thick with uncertainty. "But we need space. We need time apart to figure this out." He nodded, his face crumpling with the weight of his emotions. "Yeah," he agreed, his voice hoarse. "Maybe you're right." We stood there for a moment longer, both of us reluctant to let go. Finally he kissed my forehead, a gesture so simple, yet it felt like a goodbye. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you too," I replied. "That's why we have to do this. For both of us." He nodded, stepping back. "I'll head back to campus early," he said. I think it's better that way." I watched him go, my heart breaking as the door closed behind him. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was a necessary silence, one that we both needed. As I stood alone in the kitchen, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. We had come dangerously close to a line that should never be crossed. And though we had pulled back at the last moment, the damage had been done. Nothing would ever be the same again. After that weekend, we both knew we needed time apart. Alex returned to his college dorm early, leaving the house eerily quiet. I busied myself with work, socializing, anything to keep my mind from wandering back to those moments in the sauna, the kitchen, and our final embrace. I told myself it was for the best, that this distance would help us both see things clearly. But the truth is, it didn't take long for the distance to backfire. Instead of fading, the memories grew sharper, more vivid. Late at night, when the house was still, I found myself replaying everything in my head. The softness of his voice, the look in his eyes, the way he had held me. It wasn't just motherly affection anymore. It was something deeper, something I was afraid to name. 2 weeks passed before I heard from Alex again. I hadn't reached out, telling myself I needed to give him space, and yet I checked my phone constantly, hoping for a message. When it finally came, it was late on a Friday night. "Alex, I can't stop thinking about you. Can I come home this weekend?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I knew what I should say. I should tell him no, that we needed more time, that this was dangerous. But my fingers betrayed me. "Yes, come home." The moment I sent the message, a wave of both relief and anxiety washed over me. What was I doing? I knew that if he came back, we would be stepping into uncharted territory, crossing a line we had already blurred once. But the thought of seeing him, of feeling that connection again, overpowered my better judgment. When he arrived the next afternoon, it was like the world had paused. I opened the door, and there he was, standing in front of me with the same intense look he'd had in the sauna. Neither of us spoke. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and pulled me into his arms. I melted into the hug, breathing him in, feeling the familiarity of his body pressed against mine. Felt wrong, but it also felt like coming home. "I've missed you," he murmured into my hair. "I've missed you too," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. I pulled back, looking up at him, and in that moment, I knew there was no going back. His hand cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear I hadn't realized I was shedding. "We tried to fight it," he said softly. "But it didn't work." "No," I agreed, my voice trembling. "It didn't." For a second we stood there, teetering on the edge of something irreversible. Then he leaned in, pressing his lips to mine in a kiss that was both gentle and full of longing. I froze, my mind screaming at me to stop, to pull away, but my body had other plans. I kissed him back, and the floodgates opened. It was as if everything we had suppressed over the past few weeks, maybe even years, came pouring out in that moment. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt the heat of his body against mine. I wrapped my arms around his neck, deepening the kiss, letting myself get lost in the sensation. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing heavily. His forehead rested against mine, and I could feel the rapid beat of his heart, mirroring my own. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if that was true. "I don't know what we're doing," I confessed. He took my hand, squeezing it gently. "Neither do I," he said. "But I know I don't want to stop." I looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of doubt, but there was none. He was all in, and I realized with a start that I was too. I didn't want to fight it anymore. I didn't want to pretend that this wasn't happening. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then we won't stop." The tension between us seemed to dissolve as we both accepted what had been building for so long. He kissed me again, slower this time, savoring it, and I felt a thrill run through me as I kissed him back just as eagerly. We moved together like we had rehearsed this 1,000 times, like it was the most natural thing in the world. His hands slipped under my shirt, and I shivered at his touch, pulling him closer until there was no space left between us. "Let's go upstairs," he whispered, his voice husky with desire. I nodded, feeling a rush of anticipation that I hadn't felt in years. I took his hand, leading him up the stairs to my bedroom. My heart was pounding, a mix of fear and excitement coursing through me. I knew this was a line we couldn't uncross, but in that moment I didn't care. Once inside, he closed the door softly behind us. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, as if we were both taking in the gravity of what we were about to do. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. I stepped closer, cupping his face in my hands. "I've never been more sure of anything," I whispered. He kissed me then, with a passion that took my breath away, and I felt myself let go completely. We tumbled onto the bed, the last of our resistance crumbling away. There were no words left, only the sound of our breathing, the feel of his skin against mine, the sensation of finally giving in to something we had both wanted for so long. It was everything I hadn't let myself imagine, and more. There was a tenderness to his touch, a carefulness that reminded me he was still my son, still the boy I had raised. But there was also a new intensity, a hunger that spoke of the man he had become. I found myself responding in ways I never thought I would, caught up in the moment, in him. When it was over, we lay there in silence, tangled up in each other. I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. He ran his fingers through my hair, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "I love you," he said quietly. "I love you too," I replied, feeling a tear slip down my cheek. It was the truth, even if it was a truth I couldn't share with anyone else. We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped up in each other, knowing that the world outside wouldn't understand, that we had crossed a line we could never step back from. But in that moment it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was us. For better or worse, we were in this together now. and there was no going back.
Bye.